second of 4 talks. Our guest today is Amelia Tseng, and her primary interests lie in the sociolinguistics of language contact and immigration. In particular, she examines immersion, construction, and negotiation of personal, interpersonal, and group identity, as well as the role of attitudes and ideologies on conceptualization of identity. In simple terms, she's attentive to how ways of speaking, from specific sounds to discourse routines, can signal and respond to social and societal factors. This interest in the projection of identificational and social meanings is evident throughout her dossier. She pursued liberal arts studies at Wesley College, where she earned a BA with majors in Spanish and English and an honors thesis on Asian American identity construction. She holds an MA from Arizona State University in Spanish, where she completed the thesis, Code Switching and Style in Bilingual Radio Speech. She's currently finishing a doctoral degree in the Department of Linguistics at Georgetown University with a dissertation on dialect formation and identity shift. That project, entitled Emergent Dialect Style, Vowel Realization, and Discursive Identity Construction in DC Latinos, is supervised by Natalie Schilling and Underpin from Chicano Studies at UCLA, who serves as an external member. It's funded through an NSF Dissertation Improvement Grant. Her project is at the cutting edge of sociolinguistic investigation, focusing not on the static relations between identity categories and ways of speaking, but on the negotiation of those identities in actual interaction, thus looking at dialect development as they are constructed in daily interactions. She'll talk to you quite a bit about her methodologies too. What's interesting about her project is that she's looking at the interconnectedness of language and identity among first and second generation Latinos in DC. And this is interesting because it's a growing community, primarily Salvadoran population. And they're surrounded by the numerically dominant African American community and the white political elite. So one of the questions we might ask here is, how do these speakers respond to those pressures? Do they assimilate and blend in linguistically, or are they subtly or directly excluded and racialized through their language practices? So today Amelia is going to speak with us on her large research enterprise, whose aim again is to understand how these members position themselves vis-a-vis issues of language use, language attitudes, and social identities. And as we'll appreciate, she brings to the task an arsenal of empirical linguistic tools, allowing for sociophonetic and quantitative sociolinguistic analysis of dialect features, and qualitative and discourse analysis of how speakers draw on these particular features in conveying meaning. This integrative third wave sociolinguistic project has the potential, I believe, to become a foundational study for work on other varieties as communities cohere and emerge. I leave with you Amelia Tseng.
Can everybody hear me? Microphone issue still? This paper's on. Okay, how about now?
Yes.
Great. All right, fabulous. All right. Thank you all for coming. The title of my talk today is I'm Sounding Very Latino, Sociolinguistic Variation and Social Meaning in Washington, D.C. Latino English. I will begin with a brief overview of my guiding research themes, then focus on my current project in detail, including methods, findings, and implications. I will conclude with a discussion of possible directions for future research projects. Introduction. Immigration offers rich potential for identity work and new dialect development through contact of languages and peoples. In this presentation, I will examine the development of Latino English vernaculars in a hitherto unstudied site of Latino immigration, Washington, D.C. Latino English practices have much to offer our understanding of developing multilingual repertoires and the relationship between personal experience, group and individual identity, and new language practices. While Chicano English has been studied in the Western United States, however, little comparable research exists on other Latino immigrant groups. In today's talk, I will discuss sociolinguistic variation in a particular phonetic variable, the low front vowel a, as in the words cat and can. which varies between an ethnolectal pronunciation in Chicano English and the general American pattern. The Latino English pronunciation is often attributed to Spanish vowel system transfer into Spanish phonology and may hold stylistic potential for identity work due to its contrast with the general American pattern. In this talk, I discuss this variable in contrast in the English of first and second generation immigrants of diverse Latino backgrounds in Washington, D.C. And by so doing, I show that the ethnolectal pronunciation is present. This finding supports the argument for the Latino pronunciation as a consequence of language contact. However, I also show that sociolinguistic variation is present, demonstrating that this vowel is sensitive to factors in the broader social environment. I ground these quantitative findings in the discourse context on both the interactive level and the broader context, using speakers' own words to reveal the social, psychological motivations that may underpin individual differences in the use of the ethnolectal, general American, or even hyper-American pattern. My findings have implications for the development of new dialect systems and multilingual repertoires in bilingual situations, for language contact and variation, and for the interrelation of speakers' personal experiences with individual and group identity and new language practices in immigrant communities. My research interests, broadly speaking, lie in the sociolinguistics of language and identity practices in situations of language contact and immigration. Several decades of research in the fields of sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology have established that a reciprocal relationship exists between language and identity in terms of construction, maintenance, and change. Language influences identity since speakers use language for self-representation, and identity influences language since these representational practices affect the use or avoidance of different linguistic elements by different social groups, with consequences for the structure of their dialects and languages over time. This is particularly interesting and complex in situations of immigration, where contact between languages and cultures highlights communicative and representational needs in a multilingual environment. In this vein, the general questions of interest to me are, how do speakers use the language resources at their disposal, and what consequences does this usage have for the development of language systems, identity construction, and self-expression? General overarching questions that guide my research broadly. So given then that language practices, social psychology, and dialect development are complex and interrelated processes, I believe that an integrated analytic approach is necessary to examine different aspects of language behavior and to triangulate to interpret results. I use quantitative variation analysis to look at the distribution of different linguistic features in groups of speakers and in individuals, and qualitative discourse analysis to uncover the personal experiences, language attitudes, and self-expression that may help to motivate these patterns using speakers' own words. This research gives insight into the different social factors that may influence the transfer, survival, and loss of different linguistic variants in coalescing language systems and repertoires. It also addresses the identity potential of different linguistic variables, such as when ethnic accents, for example, are associated with groups of speakers and the qualities that are attributed to them. Now, despite Latinos forming a large and rapidly growing segment of the population, relatively little research exists on Latino language practices and the development of new language systems, as in the case of Latino English dialects and their social variation and identity potential. Research in this area is both relevant and timely as the Latino population and number of college students in particular grows. The U.S. Latino population has grown dramatically over the past few decades to over 50 million people, or more than 17% of the total U.S. population. And as you are well aware, in states such as Texas, this proportional representation can be much higher. In Texas, more than double the national average, approaching 38% of the population, and representing an increase of 23% since 1990. This growth is particularly relevant to us in terms of college enrollment. Latinos are the fastest growing college demographic, accounting for 74% of overall enrollment growth at the university level between 2010 and 2011. Research in this area is therefore of interest not only to the scientific community, but also to growing numbers of university students of Latino and other immigrant backgrounds, and has implications for broader issues of equity and diversity. Having framed my research in terms of general topics and research questions, I now move on to discuss my current research project, which addresses emergent dialects and style in the sense of new dialects created through language contact, and style as the linguistic self-representation using the resources at the speaker's disposal. I investigate this in the English of first and second generation Latino immigrants in Washington, D.C. In Latino English dialects, while Chicano English, or the English of Mexican American communities, has been studied in the western United States, notably California and Texas, in which much foundational research was conducted here at the University of Texas at Austin, little comparable research exists on other Latino immigrant groups. Yet comparative research in this vein has much to offer our understanding of the relationships between language contact, group and individual identity, and personal experience in the development of emergent multilingual repertoires and practices. And can expand our knowledge of the sociolinguistic factors that affect language system development and transfer, and insight into the way that bilinguals use the languages at their disposal to express themselves in particular ways. In this study, I integrate quantitative sociolinguistic variation and qualitative discourse analysis to uncover speech patterns and their potential motivations among first and second generation Latino and Latina men and women in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. D.C. is a particularly interesting site to look at the intersection of language, identity, and dialect development because the Latino population here is relatively new, having grown exponentially since the 1980s. And you can see here a population map of D.C. taken from the year 2000 census. Anglo-Americans are represented by red dots, concentrated primarily on the left. African Americans by blue dots, concentrated primarily on the right. And these orange dots represent Latinos. So you can see clusters here in the middle of the city, and also some out towards the edges and sort of the borders of the urban suburbs. This Latino population was historically concentrated in the central city neighborhoods of Adams Morgan and Columbia Heights, which retained their iconic status. If you ask anyone, Latino or non, in DC, where are the Latino neighborhoods, they will say, oh, Columbia Heights, Adams Morgan. But in fact, this population has been migrating to the suburbs just across the city lines in Virginia and Maryland under the same gentrification pressure and rising prices that are affecting much of the city proper. This Latino population is also uniquely diverse, probably more so than in any other United States city. Every Latin American country is represented, and social class ranging from embassy staff and diplomats to undocumented laborers in the population. Within this, DC is also the only US city to have a majority Salvadorian population. So it makes it a very interesting site to look at similarities and differences with language and identity in other areas of the country. For example, out west, where Chicano English has been studied in Mexican-dominant areas. Further, DC has a well-established history of racial segregation. And if you look at the map, you'll notice that the city remains effectively segregated. So the socio-cultural environment into which Latino immigrants are dropped is not tabula rasa. It's already populated with territorial lines, historical associations, and various ideologies about what it means to be from DC. And although the city retains these patterns in the face of gentrification, DC is also hyper-diverse in that communities from all over the world are layered over each other within the same urban spaces. So it really is a very interesting place to look at language contact, at identity display, and dialect evolution in a very different context from where it has previously been studied. I spoke with first and second generation Latino and Latina immigrants, by which I mean that either they or at least one of their parents was born outside the United States. All participants were adults and bilingual in Spanish and English. They use both languages in their daily lives, although English probably in a wider variety of contexts, and have resided in the DC area since at the age of 15 or before. And everyone has lived in the DC area for a good length of time, at least 7 years. In other words, I talked to adults, and everyone has been there since adolescence, age 15 or under, but there's no one there who moved there when they were 15 and is now 18, and has only been there for 3 years. The gap is at least 7 years. So they've been there for quite a while. Out of a large body of sociolinguistic interviews conducted over an 18-month period, I selected 12 speakers based on these parameters in order to control as much as possible for age of English acquisition and exposure to local DC dialects. I conducted these interviews, which were casual and largely unprompted, about language, identity, immigration, and life in DC, and ranged from 1 to 2 hours in length, for a total of approximately 15 hours of naturalistic data and some 3,000 data points. Some participants also recorded themselves interacting in a range of daily contexts. Ethnographic observation, follow-up interviews, and discourse analysis were used to contextualize the data in terms of social attitudes and experiences. The research questions I address in this project are as follows. 1. Are Latino English characteristics as documented in Chicano English present in Washington, D.C.? 2. What, if any, sociolinguistic factors appear to affect Latino English in this context? And I had two predictions here. First, if the variable that I'm examining is an uncomplicated consequence of language transfer from Spanish to English, then immigrant generation, where someone was born in the United States or not, should be a significant predicting factor. Secondly, this ethnic pronunciation may be sensitive to classic social variables that have been shown to affect language behavior. For example, gender, education, age, regional origin. For example, many studies show that more highly educated people use more standard or correct, prestigious language forms, while less educated people typically use less of the standard variety and more colloquial dialects that are often stigmatized as incorrect or as ghetto. Finally, I asked what social motivations may underlie these variation patterns or differences in how people are speaking within the group as individuals. In this talk, I present results of a quantitative sociolinguistic study of a particular phonetic variable, the low front vowel a, as in cat, can, actually, or bang. This vowel has been shown to play a key role in the vowel shifts of major modern North American dialects. For example, LeBeau 2001 considers the relative position of this vowel to be one of the linchpins that can catalyze changes in the vowel system overall. This vowel shows variation within North American English dialects, and previous research shows some minority group accommodation to local majority group patterns. So for example, research by Becker and Wong 2007 in New York City found Chinese Americans born in the United States to accommodate to the New York pattern of pronouncing this vowel, in which a raises and tenses preceding particular consonants, which itself is simplifying in younger generations. Research on African Americans in Detroit shows that speakers did accommodate to the local northern city shift, in which a raises categorically so that bag becomes beg. Some of you may have heard this. You get a bag for your bagel in Chicago. And African Americans in Detroit were accommodating this, depending though on their level of education and also their origin to southern or northern identities based on their family's origins. Roeder 2010 likewise found that Mexican Americans in Lansing, Michigan were assimilating to the raised northern cities pattern, but that's this accommodation dependent on age and on gender, with young women leading the trend. So that's some general information on this vowel, a, in sociolinguistics. In terms of Chicano English specifically, which is the most studied U.S. Latino English dialect, this vowel is usually pronounced differently than in general American English. This ethnolectal pronunciation is low and backed, so that a, as in the word cat, sounds almost like caught, lower and further back. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And this is something which likely originates in language transfer, since Spanish is a different vowel system than English and has been documented for some time, beginning with research on Southwest and Texas Mexican American communities by researchers such as Benji Wald, and more recently concentrated in Texas and California by Eric Thomas, Matthew Gordon, and Carmen Fott, who've established that that same contrast between the low-back Chicano realization and the higher-fronted general American pattern does exist. It needs to be pointed out, before moving on, that Latino English varieties are not just imperfect learner English systems, as in the case of fossilized L2 acquisition, but rather are linguistic systems that emerge in their own right from language contact, and so form English dialects which may ultimately come to be spoken by non-bilingual, monolingual English speakers. And these dialects show internal sociolinguistic variation, as for example in Roeder's findings that Mexican American accommodation to the northern cities pronunciation was sensitive to gender and age. Younger women use the more standard variety, older men use the more ethnic variety, ethnic entre comillas. Finally, the differences between these American and Latino patterns have been shown to hold stylistic potential for identity display, as for example in Northern California, where Penny Eckert showed that adolescents in a middle school use this Latino pronunciation for group identity to be seen as cool or tough as part of the in crowd. And another example is in Raleigh, North Carolina, where Philip Carter has established that Mexican-American child first acquired the general American pattern and then adopted the Latino pronunciation during adolescence, likely because of a new school environment and a changing social orientation. So let's take a look at this variable itself a little bit more closely. Sorry about that. I have said that there is a difference between the general American way of pronouncing the a vowel and the Latino version, which sounds lower and is produced further back in the mouth. So if we look at the general American pattern, I'm going to show you something that you may not know about your vowel. Okay, so let's start by saying the vowel in two contexts. Actually and bank. So say these words, please, and pay particular attention to how you pronounce the vowel. Actually.
Actually.
Bank.
Bank.
Actually.
Actually.
Bank.
Bank.
What you might start to notice is that you're actually pronouncing the vowel slightly differently in those two words. In the word bank, it's slightly higher and further forward than in the word actually. This is called a nasal raising pattern because the vowel raises before a nasal consonant. Bank. And it's extremely typical of American English dialects, as follows.
Actually. Actually. Banked. Actually. Banked.
So you can hear that the pre-nasal vowel is raising slightly. Actually, bank. Actually, bank. And we can actually see this raising pattern visually, represented in a vowel chart. I'll do a quick walkthrough here without getting too technical so that we're all on the same page just moving forward with this talk. This is a visual representation of the acoustic properties of your vowels based on where they are produced in your mouth. And this is represented along two dimensions. Vowel height vertically, whether a vowel is high or low, and horizontally, whether a vowel is pronounced towards the front of the mouth or in the back. And this is measured in terms of formant values from the speech signal, with F2 corresponding directly to fronting and backing. So a vowel pronounced in the front of your mouth would have a big F2 value, and a vowel pronounced in the back of your mouth would have a small one, okay, a small number. F1, this is the slightly tricky bit, corresponds inversely to vowel height. So a high vowel would have a small F1 value, and a low vowel has a big one, okay? This vowel space chart is set up as if it were a cross-section of your head. So, if you will, please turn your head to your left. Okay? And imagine that this vowel space chart represents your mouth from the side. So, high front vowels are pronounced up here, where you can imagine is your lip and teeth area. And low back vowels are pronounced closer to here, which you can imagine sort of in the back of your mouth approaching your throat. Okay? So, for example, E, the vowel E, as in the word beat, is a high front vowel. So if you keep your head turned that way, and you say the word beat, beat, you can feel that it's high up and towards the front of your mouth. It's towards this way, right? You can slide that backwards along the F2 continuum in the word boot. So try that. Beat, boot. There's a slight difference, and you don't think about it much on a daily basis, but it's there. It's a difference in a high front vowel and a high low one. Okay, so that's going forward and backwards along the F2 dimension. We can also go up and down along F1, as in beat, bet, bat, bot. Beat, bet, bat, bot. Bot, bat, bet, beat. Okay, so we're sliding up and down along that vertical F1 continuum and moving slightly at an angle as we do it, okay? That is how your vowel space is working for you, okay? So returning to the actual vowel under investigation, if you look at this chart of one American English speaker's vowel space, you will notice that there is quite a large difference between a as in actually and n as in bank. There's quite a gap there. Okay, there's quite a large difference. The prenasal version is much higher and further forward, and that is what we call the nasal raising pattern, typical of American English. In contrast to that pattern, the same vowel in Latino English tends to be pronounced lower and further back. And this is something that is particularly noticeable in that prenasal position where the typical American English has that very raised and fronted pattern that you just saw. So here for comparison are the general American and Latino English versions of the same vowel pronounced in the same word.
Actually.
Okay. So this is the general American a.
Actually.
And here's the Latino English version.
Actually. Actually. Actually.
So that one's higher and further forward.
Actually.
actually. That one's lower and further back. It's a subtle difference, but you can hear it if you pay attention, and you can also see it in the vowel chart. Okay? So now let's look at it in pre-nasal position, where the typical American pattern raises quite a bit.
Paint. Bank. Paint. Bank.
Okay, so we have bank and bank. It's raising, but not nearly as much in the Latino pattern. Okay, so you can hear the difference between those patterns. And again, you can see this represented in the vowel space, where that distance between a and the pre-nasal raising is much smaller in the Latina speaker for women and also for men across the board. Having discussed this variable, and we will return to it, I now turn to an overview of my analytic methodology. I use quantitative sociolinguistic variation analysis to analyze the distribution of these varying Latino and American a pronunciations treated as a continuous and not binary variable. I use mixed effects statistical modeling in the arbitral program to see which, if any, linguistic and social factors, such as age or immigrant generation, affected vowels above the level of chance. So, for example, do older speakers use the Latino or American pattern more? Arbitral offers an advantage over a more traditional variation analysis program such as Arbitral for my field data, in that it can address continuous variables, which allows for a more nuanced look at vowel pronunciation. It can address an unequal number of tokens, which allows for a fuller picture of the sociolinguistic interview as an interaction, and it can account for random effects such as individual speakers. So for my study, it was the more appropriate approach. The dependent variable under consideration was a in terms of F1 corresponding to vowel raising and lowering, and F2 corresponding to fronting and backing. Each vowel token was identified and measured using computational methods to measure F1 and F2 at the midpoint of each vowel. These measurements were normalized so that meaningful comparisons could be made between male and female speakers. And all of this was done using the forced alignment and vowel extraction suite from the University of Pennsylvania and Lobanov's Z-transformation method. I tested linguistic and social independent variables for their effects on vowel pronunciation. Linguistic factors were preceding and following phonetic environment in order to see if the sounds that come before or after the vowel have an effect on its pronunciation. Social factors tested were the classic sociolinguistic variables of gender, age, and highest level of educational attainment. And given the population of study, I added immigration, generation, and national origin. Speaker was included as a random effect to determine whether individuals had an effect on group findings. In terms of linguistic factors, F1 and F2 were significantly conditioned by preceding and following phonetic environment, with a p-value of less than 0.05%. Breaking this down further, we can see that the different linguistic environments affected a differently. So, for example, apical consonants, which are pronounced with the tip of your tongue, as in the word tap, 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 apical consonant, tip of the tongue, were most likely to condition a rising if they came before the vowel. And these values that you see here on the right represent coefficient weights, not raw formant measurements. So this indicates that preceding apical consonants, tap, have the biggest effect size in predicting a change in vowel height in relation to the group average. It doesn't mean that the vowel in words like tap are overall higher. It means that following t has the biggest effect in whether or not this vowel will raise. So it's a difference in the relationship. It's not a raw number, it's a predictor. Okay? And liquids, as in lap, also had a strong but lesser effect, conditioning vowel lowering. And you can see the different effects of the linguistic environments on the vowel here. For following phonetic environment, I find that nasals have the strongest effect, conditioning vowel raising as in bank. And for F2, we see that preceding velar consonants have the strongest effect on vowel fronting, as in the word cap, and that liquids have the strongest effect on vowel backing. For F2, again, we see that the strong pre-nasal pattern, where following nasals have by far the strongest effect causing vowel fronting. So if we put all of this together, we see that phonetic conditioning, pre-nasal raising and fronting, we see these speakers are speaking English, which might seem like an obvious conclusion, but is actually an important point to clarify when dealing with dialects in a language context situation. The different conditioning effects that I just described with graphics, apical, liquid, nasal, etc., are consistent with previous findings on American English as summarized by Roeder 2006. This tells us that these Latino speakers are following the rules of the American English phonological system and not variably approximating a values due to incomplete systems knowledge. In other words, these bilinguals are speaking English, but what kind of English are they speaking? Remember, the first research question was, are Latino English characteristics present in DC in terms of this particular vowel? I now turn to an investigation of the vowel more closely to answer whether these speakers are following the general American or the Latino English pattern. By comparing my speakers' vowel averages with the average pronunciation in DC, I find that Latino speakers are raising less than their DC counterparts. Their nasal raising pattern is weaker. This indicates that they are using the relatively low and back to Chicano English pronunciation. And if we quickly revisit the vowel space charts, this confirms that visually because prenasal N is further back and lower than in the general American pronunciation. So I find that the Latino English pattern is indeed present in these speakers in Washington, D.C. In terms of social factors, I find that the vowel is conditioned by age and origin with a p-value of less than 0.05. And this is interesting in that the language transfer hypothesis would predict that immigration generation would be significant, and it wasn't. I'll begin by addressing age since that's the more traditional finding. I find that vowel fronting and backing along the F2 dimension is conditioned by speaker age, with the oldest speakers most likely to front their vowels, and the youngest speakers least likely, although with a smaller effect size. This type of result is well established in sociolinguistic research and may relate to orientations towards standard and covert prestige as the community grew in numbers since the 1980s. Vowel height and fronting or backing were conditioned by speaker origin. This was another surprising result. To begin with vowel height, the strongest raising effect was caused by mixed Venezuelan and Cuban heritage, and the strongest lowering effects by Bolivian and Mexican heritage. In terms of F2, vowel fronting was most strongly conditioned by Paraguayan, mixed Salvadorian and Mexican heritage, and mixed Venezuelan and Cuban heritage. Vowel backing was most conditioned by Guatemalan and Colombian heritage. And this result is surprising because it doesn't really make sense in terms of language transfer of Spanish dialects or in terms of groupings within countries of origin. As follows. Quantitative analysis returned age and country of origin as significant predictors of vowel variation. Great. But what internal patterns can we see inside the origin results that might explain its significance? For vowel height, we have Venezuelan and Cuban heritage high, as in the general American English pattern, and Mexican origin predicting a lower pronunciation, as in the Latino English prediction. For vowel fronting and backing, we have Paraguayan and mixed Central American and South American Caribbean heritage, and for the back ethnolectal pronunciation, Colombia and Guatemala. And that doesn't make sense, because at first, we might say, oh, well, this origin result probably has something to do with language transfer from the original Spanish dialects, but a closer look at regional dialectology shows that that's not the best explanation. While that explanation might possibly have some currency in terms of Caribbean and Mexican vowel variation, and research on vowel variation between Spanish dialects is very much in its infancy. There's really no good reason why Rio de la Plata, Central American, and Mexican dialects should group, or why Colombian and Guatemalan dialects should group. So applying Occam's razor and going to the linguistic data at hand, I think there's a better explanation. Statistical analysis also returned a speaker effect, so I went to individual speakers to identify particular patterns. I compared speakers' vowel averages to the average DC pronunciation as per LeBeau, Broberg, and Ash's extensive compilation of North American dialects, the Atlas of North American English. Here I separated out prenasal and non-prenasal context in order to really focus in on the typical patterns of general American and Latino English. So here you see the F1 and F2 ranges for in prenasal and non-nasal contexts in general DC speakers. So here, as I add in my speakers, you can see that the strong pattern is the Latino English pattern. Almost all of the speakers have a low and backed Latino English pronunciation in that very typical prenasal context. Although there's one speaker who's right on average, and the majority show a clear backing and fronting pattern in the backing and lowering pattern in typical manner. And there are also two who are further forward on average, which I refer to as a hyper-American pattern because it exaggerates features of the standard dialect. These different patterns are particularly interesting because this prenasal variation is one of the stronger areas in which Latino and American English diverge. Looking at the regular non-nasal app, we see that many speakers were in fact in line with the DC average. However, there were some speakers with a lower pronunciation, Viviana y Carolina, and 3 with the hyper-American pattern, Candida, Emmanuel, and Marcos. So putting all of this together, we see a pattern where the Latino English, not the general American English pattern, is dominant in prenasal contexts. One speaker who is always right on average for DC, Felix, and some speakers who show hyper-American patterns. And some speakers, and this is really interesting, who show both Latino and hyper-American pronunciations. Marcos, Emmanuel, and Lisa. So going to the individual level, we see that the average general American speaker is an individual who I have called Felix. The hyper-American pattern is used by Diana and Gracia, and 3 speakers, Candida, Emmanuel, and Marcos, show a mixture of hyper-American and Latino patterns. What I believe best explains these patterns is something that has not been widely addressed in variationist studies, which is elite secondary high school education. This hypothesis explains the puzzling original origins result. If we take a look at speakers' secondary educational levels, we see that Felix, Diana, and Marcos are most likely to use the higher, more fronted, more standard pronunciations, and what these individuals have in common is attendance at elite public and private preparatory institutions. In contrast, Candida, Jacobo, and Viviana did not attend that kind of elite institution. Even within this, though, we find exceptions. So Emmanuel and Marcos have mixed hyper-American and Latino patterns. Diana has the hyper-American pattern and no Latino pattern. Candida has mixed patterns without elite education, and another speaker who I've called Hector has an elite educational background without any of the hyper-American pattern present. I argue that in order to explain this, we need to address the concept of linguistic access and social identity, both of which are highlighted during adolescence and high school. Attendance at an elite educational institution gives speakers access to standard and prestige dialects, in this case the general American English, which enjoys both unmarked and overt prestige in the United States as a whole. This standard is linked to the white majority. As Diana commented, her school was just like full of white kids. There wasn't a variety of anything, it was just like all white kids. These language attitudes are part of how speakers orient to different social groups and manage the tension they often feel between different aspects of their identity. In this, standard English is associated with whiteness, but also with education and social class, while sounding Latino can be used to index ethnic identity and related discourses of social class and authenticity. And these associations can only be discovered through qualitative analysis, through ethnography and through discourse. They were not revealed in the quantitative portion of the analysis. If we go again to speakers' own words, we see these attitudes clearly manifested through metalinguistic commentary. Gracia refers to having her identity challenged by other Latinos, saying, I just remember these kids saying, like, you're such a whitey. And then eventually I kind of like came to that realization, it's like because of the way I talk. Marcos attributes his different speech to his elite high school education, commenting, "That's why I sound different, educated when I talk." And Hector comments, "I don't talk like a white dude, I have my rhythm. And it's a Latino rhythm, it's a Spanish rhythm, and it's despite it being me speaking English." Having filled in this context, the exceptional speakers can now be explained in terms of both access to the standard variety, awareness of the prestige attached to it, and orientation to other aspects of identity, including, but not limited to, ethnicity. Emmanuel and Marcos both attended elite high schools but come from very working class backgrounds, and have a strong orientation to the old pre-gentrification DC and iconic Latino neighborhoods and culture. They may therefore have learned how to alternate between standard and ethnolectal forms, depending on the interactional context and on their own goals. In contrast, Diana, who also comes from a very working class background and attended an elite high school, shows no Latino pattern. She has the hyper-American pattern only. I think the difference here has to do with her identity with her orientation towards academic achievement. She went to a community college, wants to go to a four-year college, and hopes to be a professional, whereas neither Marcos nor Emmanuel was interested in this path. Candida, on the other hand, again from a working class background, shows mixed patterns and uses the hyper-American pronunciation without having attended an elite institution. Again, I think this has to do with orientation to academic interests, and in her case, a nerd identity. Candida is very studious. She likes anime. She wants to do a PhD, etc. And this association between standard or even hyper-standard English and studious qualities is something that Mary Buckles has articulated in research on nerd linguistic behavior, where it is also racialized as white. Now, I'm not saying that Candida is trying to act white, but the academic nerd meanings associated with hyper-standardization may help explain why she alternates between this unexpected pattern and the ethnolectal pronunciation. She certainly expressed confusion based on the conflict between how she is perceived based on her ethnic background and other aspects of her identity. For example, although she excels at community college and hopes to study her PhD, her coworkers regularly assume that she is a high school dropout and possibly pregnant. And this tension is expressed through her comment that people frequently express confused. They're like, "We're confused, you're Mexican, bud." Finally, Hector is very, very interesting because he has an elite education without the hyper-American pattern. He uses only the Latino pronunciation. Hector also has a very strong metalinguistic awareness. He repeatedly made comments such as, "I don't talk like a white dude, I have a Latino rhythm. I'm sounding very Latino." Like Marcos and Emmanuel, Hector orients strongly to the old, iconic DC, authentic Latino neighborhoods and culture. But perhaps most important in his case is the tension between his perceived racial characteristics and his identity. He states explicitly that he has to represent his ethnic identity through language and behavior because, as an albino, he cannot physically manifest his culture. I have to represent. I'm constantly declaring this is my culture because I physically can't show it to you. So to summarize, in answer to the first research question, are Latino English characteristics present in DC? I find that yes, results support that Latino speakers in DC indeed use the ethnolectal form, lending support to the argument that the variant has its roots in language contact between Spanish and English in the U.S. context. The answer to research question 2 proved more complex. What sociolinguistic factors affect Latino English in DC? Variation is conditioned by both linguistic environment and social factors. My prediction here was that if the so-called Latino pronunciation is a consequence of language transfer, then immigrant generation in terms of foreign or native birth would be a significant predictor. This was not found to be true. I also predicted that the ethnolectal pattern may be sensitive to sociolinguistic variables. This was true, and within this, I found national origin and age to affect realization, but differently for F1 and F2. This indicates that F1 and F2 may operate separately, which is somewhat supported by research on Chicano English. In terms of national origin, I found no patterning by dialect, region, or by social class, which would have been two likely explanations for national origin as a significant predictor. The answer to these questions, I believe, lies in research question 3. What social motivations may underlie this variation? Through fine-grained analysis of individuals in terms of their linguistic behavior, social contexts, orientation to identity, and sociolinguistic attitudes, I have shown that the use of the Latino and general American, or even hyper-American realizations may relate to adolescent education. Within this, individual patterns may be affected by personal identity, social orientation, and external perceptions, particularly racialization. At the same time, however, my analysis showed a great deal of absence of immigration generation as a significant predictor for variation indicates the relationship between L1 and L2 transfer effects may be mediated by non-linguistic external factors from the sociocultural environment. So by supplementing quantitative findings with qualitative investigation of the discourse context in which the Latino and general American variants occur, I find this to be the case, with discourse analysis, speaker meta-commentary, and ethnographic observation used to uncover the social and psychological motivations that may underpin these individual patterns in usage of the ethnolectal and the general American pattern. So, while I find the ethnolectal variant to be present in the DC Latino speakers, my analysis shows a good deal of variation between speakers and individuals, based on the factors I have described. This finding points to the complexity of the processes of language transfer and new feature diffusion. While the present study is not longitudinal, this finding has implications for feature transmission and dialect coalescence in that different segments of the population may be more likely to lose or retain the ethnolectal or transfer feature based on the social and identity factors I have discussed. Differential patterns for vowel height and fronting and backing also indicate that F1 and F2 may operate independently in terms of variation, with implications for sound changes and the indexical relationship between phonetic variation and stylistic language practices. I productively complemented quantitative findings with qualitative analysis of individual vowel variation and the communicative context in which Latino and general American variants occur. This revealed the language attitudes and personal experiences with language and identity that may influence speech patterns. And integrated methods thus played a very important role in uncovering the social psychological motivations that may affect this transfer and this behavior. Research support. Thanks are due to the National Science Foundation, which has generously supported this research through a doctoral dissertation research improvement grant. Research support has also been provided by Georgetown University's Department of Linguistics in collaboration with the Georgetown University Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program. And here you can see my RA team, who have been extremely enthusiastic and fabulous through every stage of this project. Finally, while I independently gathered the data for this project, it has connections to the larger Language and Communication in Washington, D.C. project in the Georgetown Department of Linguistics. And this broad base of support has enriched the study, and I think also speaks to the interest and relevance of research in this area to students and to universities, as well as to the scientific community more broadly. In future, I plan to extend research on language and multilingual identity to new and established sites of immigration. I plan to build a multi-generational corpus of data recorded in a variety of social contexts, including self-recording by speakers without a researcher present, and sociolinguistic interviews. This more comprehensive approach to data collection will provide a rich source for examining all aspects of multilingual repertoires, including Spanish and English variation, dialect contact, emergent language systems, and code switching between the different languages. This will also provide insight into how these repertoires coalesce in consecutive immigrant generations, and how speakers make stylistic use of the linguistic resources at their disposal for purposes of identity and self-expression. In particular, in Texas, I'd like to propose a project on language and Latino identity. The quote, "Now I sound Mexican," is taken from one of my interviews. And although Texas's Latino population is currently a historically Mexican-American, approximately 80%, people of other Latino heritages and a significant Salvadorian population are found. Texas actually has the third largest Salvadorian population in the United States, according to the Hispanic Center. and several of my interviewees mentioned friends and relatives who have moved here. This proposed project would take as a starting point the question of what it means to sound Mexican to Latinos of non-Mexican heritage and recent Mexican immigrants in Texas, where the rich historical Mexican-American presence offers an untapped background of cultural ideologies in this regard, and a rich tradition of sociolinguistic research on Spanish and English varieties provides a productive comparison for this research. My project would build on and extend previous and ongoing research on multilingual competencies by looking at bilingual practices in both languages in unstructured social contexts. And this adds a new dimension for calls on research on Latino language practices as encompassing regional variation, monolingualism in two languages, and shades of bilingualism as unified by the commonality of ethnicity. A quote modified from Santa Ana 1993, which I would add to that this commonality of ethnicity is not inherent but is constructed by speakers through social practices including language in the context of hegemonic social discourses, and that it is the common experience of these pressures as well as shared language and aspects of home culture that create the commonality, and that this can be researched and studied analytically through speakers' linguistic output and their overt and covert acceptance and rejection of the social qualities associated with linguistic practices. I see this research as inherently interdisciplinary and see rich potential for collaboration with existing projects that some of you are familiar with here at the University of Texas at Austin. Projects on Spanish and English in Texas, and cross-departmentally with other language departments, the Center for Mexican American Studies, the Institute for Latin American Studies, etc. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Yes, my question. Thank you very much, first of all. I'm trying to think of your tokens, and if I compare the word, for example, BAM to bank, my name is going to be bilabial, it's going to be velar. If it's velar, then my second and third formants are going to come together. My second formant's going to rise, my third formant's going to fall. If my word is BAM, I've got a bilabial, then I'm going to have both my second and third formants drop. So I'm wondering how this is going to affect your measurements if indeed you are using words like BAM and bank with different points of articulation that have a different transition on second and third formants.
That's an excellent question. I tested initially with distinguishing the different nasal environments and found the same results. So there was a difference in the in degree of raising, conditioned by that labial or bilabial or velar position, but nasals as a whole were still a much stronger effect than the other.
So you used both the BAMs and the banks?
Yeah, I did, and I tested for those separately.
And you did see transition differences?
Yes, but they still clumped together. So it was well within the normal pattern. It was still by far the strongest effect. I think it was about 3 times stronger than the other ones.
And just to remind me, if I remember right, if you have a low vowel to begin with, first formants that are nasalized are actually raised a little bit.
Yeah.
If you have a high vowel, nasalization lowers first formants a little bit. Isn't that right? Because it's more of a centralized first formant.
Yeah, because this particular vowel is a centralized one. Yeah, low big one.
I think so.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Non-linguist question. I'm presuming that a number of these subjects and students study in public schools with an African American population.
Excellent question. Yes.
And you don't really mention it in the presentation. But since you also mentioned that it seems to affect patterns that are sort of a conceptions of whiteness.
Yes.
Affect speech patterns among some of these students. Couldn't the same be said for conceptions of blackness?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So if I understand your question correctly, what you're asking is, given the racialization of DC as a whole, with black and white norms that immigrants can orient to, and given the contact with the black community that Latino speakers in the working class are likely to have, are they accommodating to that variety as well, or would we predict that? Yes. The answer to that is yes, it would be predicted. Yes, observationally, there seems to be a degree of that. It doesn't seem to be in relation to this particular vowel, although evidence on this vowel in African American communities is very small. And that as regards the general linguistic system, I wouldn't like, based on this evidence, to speculate about the degree of that. I can tell you that having spoken with people, they do express an affiliation for African American culture. They also, you know, in terms of, I suppose, racializing on that side of the black-white binary, they also did spend a lot of time in African American neighborhoods, and I've heard people code switch between something that sounds more like African American English. I think, in terms of this vowel, I wouldn't expect to see a dialectal difference there because African American English doesn't do this kind of extreme behavior the way Chicano English does. If anything, actually, it tends to be even a little higher than the standard American pattern. But I have heard speakers use other features that are associated with African American English. However, those features are also associated with Southern White English and with working class English dialects, so without more study, I wouldn't want to say which direction that's coming from. But they do use vocabulary and grammar and stuff like that too. Yes, sir.
Well, following along the lines of Jason's question, and again, a non-linguistic specialist question, but thinking of, especially when you showed F1s being at the lowest level, both Mexicans and Guatemalans, it really made me think to what extent, or if that can be documented or has been documented, some of those Guatemalans and Mexicans spoke first an indigenous language and only secondarily a Spanish language, and therefore we're transitioning towards a third language in that particular.
That's a very interesting point, especially in terms of third language acquisition and dialect transfer studies. In answer to these particular speakers, I don't think that's the case, because my Mexican-American speaker was actually born in California, and she discussed her sort of bilingual childhood and death and never mentioned indigenous languages. Neither did the Guatemalan speaker. The people who did mention that actually were from Paraguay, and they mentioned a couple of times different competencies that they had with indigenous languages. But that is a very interesting question. Vowel systems in general haven't been studied probably to the depth that they need to be in dialectology in general, and in particular in Latin American varieties of Spanish and with indigenous contact. I don't think that much research exists. Although there's starting to be some research in the United States at Boston University and Ohio State.
Did you see any significant changes between the Latinos that were mixed? Like, I think there was one that was Mexican and Salvadoran, from other people who were just like representing one identity.
It didn't test as a significant predictor in the statistical analysis. That's something that I was on the lookout for, and it didn't come out as significant. It also didn't seem to be a big deal in the qualitative analysis. That's not to say that it isn't for some speakers, or that, you know, with a different sampling, it wouldn't turn out to be a factor. I would expect it to have some kind of consequence for speech and identity practices. But it seemed to have more to do with where they went to high school and how they felt about that, you know, who their peer group was. Was there another one?
I had a question about the basically the ANAE figures you're using for general American. Are those just kind of overall normalized figures, or are they regionally specific? Because as you mentioned, why you pick this variable is that it's extremely important, you know, in the whole Northeast corridor. I know, and particularly, I don't know about DC in particular, but when you get down to Baltimore and Philly, it's really, even to the degree of phonemic split, it's a really important dialect factor. And so, do you think it's possible that what you're seeing as acquisition of reform and hyper-acquisition might actually be acquisition toward a different target?
Different dialect?
I mean, with a more accurate acquisition of what's just simply a more raised dialect form in general.
So you're asked, if I understand you correctly, you're asking if those hyper-realized pronunciations could be normal realizations compared to a different local norm?
Yes.
Okay. I don't think so, for a couple of reasons. For the Atlas of North American English numbers, I took them from Washington, D.C., because they do vary quite a bit by region. Also, in terms of the dialects most likely to be present in D.C., the findings were not consistent with that. Okay, so there was nothing in the patterns that I saw that would indicate they were following, for example, the Philadelphia split-ass system.
Okay.
Thank you. There was a hand over here and then over here.
Yes, the subjects that you had, were they living and going to school in Washington, D.C., or were they just attending school in Washington, D.C., and they lived in the suburb area?
They all lived in the D.C. area, and the majority of them, there's a little bit of a difference depending on when they came to D.C. because the settlement patterns had changed, but the majority of them started out in the central city iconic barrios, in Adams Morgan, in Columbia Heights. Some of them are still there, some of them then kind of got pushed out, squeezed out by gentrification to the suburbs. And out in the suburbs where these speakers are residing and some of the more new immigrants, those are now also ethnic enclaves. It's actually, those areas are actually more dynamic in terms of daily culture now than the iconic neighborhoods are. But they're not seen as special. Yes, sir.
I'm just thinking about, you're talking about social, identity practices, and you mentioned like you had some people doing interviews or doing sort of self-done or like taking their social practices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like, did you see any or hear any differences based on the context of the conversations between, like, within the speaker, or?
That is an excellent question. I predicted that I would, and qualitatively, I'm not seeing a big vowel variation, but I wouldn't like to fully answer it until I wrote the stats on those. My prediction would be that in those different interactional contexts, I might see something different. I also think it's possible that there's going to be stylistic variation, but that it's going to be happening on a sophisticated level that's not going to be revealed by quantitative analysis that relies on token counts. Because I think that a lot of the identity moves that people are doing are probably not going to relate to really broad ideas of ethnicity, as in I'm about to represent my Latino ethnicity using the low back vowel realization, but have more to do with how people are positioning themselves within the micro interactions. So for example, if I ask them a question and they want to sound very authoritative and correct in their answer, that might be an environment in which you would see the hyper-standard pronunciation. If somebody is talking about bonding with members of the Latino Student Association, then I might expect to see the backed realization, but that kind of difference within an interaction is so subtle that a quantitative model like I use wouldn't pick it up. I will have to go to the discourse and look at what they're actually saying in those moods, particularly with the self-reported data, because since it's not interviews, it's much more freeform. But it will be a very, very useful thing to look at. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about the American-born Latinos who were taught literal American English, but then when they went to school in adolescence, they kind of adopted that. I was curious if how there's kind of a hyper-American section, that there might be a hyper-Latino kind of way to speak, and those people that adopted the language later on might not have the natural flow of that back A, or
they might have it to a lesser degree or something like that.
Or they might be over-exaggerating it in a way that makes it sound hyper-Latino.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to look at a sort of hyper-ethnolectal pronunciation. I think, again, the best way to do that would be to gather some discourse in different contexts and look at what's actually going on. So compare the same speaker's realizations relative to themselves, because we don't have an average value, an absolute value for the average in Chicano English. But you could certainly say, oh, okay, you know, Sylvia is using a much further back one here than she usually does. Yeah, thank you.